When my cousin handed me the borrowed college entrance exam materials, she gave me a teasing smile, her voice playful yet curious. "Did you borrow this for Jack?" she asked with a knowing tone. "You really go the extra mile for him, especially now that the exams are coming up. If he makes it into a university, all your efforts will finally pay off." I simply smiled back but didn't bother to correct her. She had gotten it all wrong. The truth was, the books weren't for Jack, they were for me. And as for Jack, there would be no future filled with happiness between us, only more of the suffering I had come to know too well. But I had made my decision. I wasn't going to stay by his side anymore. For years, I had sacrificed everything for Jack. I starved myself just so he could eat better, saved every penny to support him, and braved scorching summers and freezing winters running a tiny food stall to fund his education. Every day brought new challenges, from the sneers of passersby to the physical exhaustion that weighed me down. But despite all that, I told myself it was worth it, until it wasn't. In the end, none of my sacrifices mattered to him. In my previous life, Jack succeeded. He became a university professor, admired by his colleagues, yet he looked down on me for being nothing more than a street vendor. "You embarrassed me in front of my peers," he once said, his words cutting like a knife. What followed was even worse. Jack decided I wasn't good enough to stand beside him, but I was good enough to take care of his problem. He left his paralyzed mother in my care, giving me strict orders. "From now on, you stay home and take care of Mom. That way, no one will have a reason to mock us." No choice. I obeyed. He gave me a small allowance, barely enough to make ends meet, and I used it to stretch every penny. My days were consumed with cooking meals for his spoiled daughter, attending to his mother's every need, and dealing with the endless frustration of being treated like a servant. I barely ate, slept only when I couldn't keep my eyes open, and woke up to repeat the same miserable routine. I never knew how much Jack earned, but I assumed we were struggling. Often I deprived myself of food to ensure the family was fed. On nights when hunger gnawed at my stomach, I would sneak into the kitchen to drink cold water, hoping it would ease the ache. Later, I discovered the truth. Jack had been hiding most of his salary, funneling it to Susan, a woman he trusted far more than he ever trusted. He funded her business ventures while I scraped by, giving up every part of myself for the family he claimed to care about. Years passed. His mother eventually passed away, and his daughter grew up. By then, I was a shadow of my former self, plagued by chronic illnesses and a body worn down from years of neglect. But Jack's disdain for me only grew. "You don't understand me, Nisete," he said one day, his voice devoid of any warmth. "You can't connect with my ambitions or my thoughts. Someone like you, a housewife, has nothing in common with someone like me." Those words confirmed what I had suspected for years. I was nothing more than a stepping stone to him, someone to use and discard once I had outlived my usefulness. But that was the past. This time, I wasn't going to let history repeat itself. I wouldn't starve, struggle, or sacrifice myself for someone who didn't value me. I had my own dreams now, and I would fight for them, no matter what it took. The borrowed books weren't for Jack, they were for me, and they represented the first step toward a future where I no longer lived in someone else's shadow. This time, I would write my own story, one where I was the hero, not the supporting character. Jack clutched his head as if the weight of the world had fallen on him, declaring dramatically that he couldn't take it anymore. He acted as though he were the victim in all of this, the one who had endured the most pain. To my shock, even our daughter sided with him. "Mom, let Dad go," she said in a cold, dismissive tone. "Can't you see how much he suffers every day being with you? He deserves to be happy with Susan. She's been waiting for him all these years. Don't you think it's time he found peace?" Her words cut deeper than any wound. The child I had raised, the one I had given everything for, had turned her back on me without a second thought. Susan, the woman they both praised so highly, was everything I was not. She was a successful businesswoman, confident and influential. She could buy Jack luxury cars and designer gifts with ease, take him to extravagant venues, and introduce him to people who mattered in high society. To them, I was just a simple housewife, someone who lacked refinement and ambition. But no one seemed to remember the sacrifices I had made. They forgot that it was me who taught Jack his first words when he was just a toddler. They forgot the nights I carried him through pouring rain to the hospital, terrified as his fever raged. All those years of devotion meant nothing compared to Susan's wealth and status. One day, in a moment of sheer rage and heartbreak, I lost control. I smashed everything in the house, the pain and betrayal pouring out of me, and screamed, "I won't let you have your happy ending," I shouted, but they didn't flinch. Instead, they looked at me with cold, detached stare, as if I had become a stranger, or worse, a lunatic. Not long after they left, Jack and our daughter packed their things and moved into Susan's luxurious home, leaving me behind to face the wreckage of my life. When my stomach cancer flared up and I was vomiting blood on the floor, they didn't even bother to check on me. They were too busy vacationing, posing for photos at scenic destinations, basking in the glow of their newfound family life. Their pictures were everywhere. Jack, the esteemed professor, and Susan, the elegant business mogul. They looked like the perfect couple, their lives an envy-inducing spectacle for all to see. Friends and strangers alike praised them as a match made in heaven. I watched from the shadows, feeling like an outsider to the life I had once fought so hard to build. But that was the moment I realized something important. I didn't need Jack anymore. I didn't want to be part of their perfect little world. If they were destined to be together, then I would let them have each other. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of breaking me any further. This time, I was determined to take a different path, one that didn't include Jack, Susan, or even the daughter who had betrayed me. I would rewrite my story from the ground up. Free from the chains of my past, I made a silent promise to myself. I would never again sacrifice my life for people who didn't value me. When I returned home after making this decision, I found Jack in the kitchen. He was cooking noodles using the refined flour I had exchanged for 10 pounds of coarse grain, a trade I had made to stretch our food supplies. He added an egg to the soup and some fresh greens from my garden, the smell of the dish filling the small kitchen with a fragrant aroma. Beside him stood Susan, dressed in a delicate floral blouse. She sniffed the air softly, her face lighting up with exaggerated delight. "It smells amazing," she murmured, her voice sweet and calculated. "Your cooking is incredible, Jack. How lucky I would be to eat noodles like this every day." Her act of innocence and charm was painfully obvious to me. But Jack didn't seem to notice, or perhaps he didn't care. In our village, food was rationed based on labor points, and meals like this were considered a luxury. Yet here they were, using what little I had worked so hard to save, acting as if they had earned it. But I stayed silent, my resolve firm. This time I would rise above them, and I would do it on my own terms. Jack and Susan were both educated youth sent to the countryside as part of the government's rural placement program. Jack, despite his scholarly background, struggled to adapt to the harsh realities of rural life. He couldn't even dig a proper furrow in the soil when he first arrived. Susan, on the other hand, was even more helpless. On her very first day, she stubbed her toe and had to rest in the youth dormitory for 2 weeks, claiming she was unfit for hard labor. Life in the countryside was unforgiving, especially during the harvest season. The food they received in exchange for their labor was meager, barely enough to survive. Every meal was a struggle, and the constant hunger etched desperation into their face. Coarse grains, which scratched painfully against their throats, were gulped down without complaint because there was no alternative. It was during this time that my life became entangled with Jack's. One fateful day, I slipped and fell into the river while trying to fetch water. Jack, despite his inexperience, rushed to save me. We clung to each other for warmth after the incident, both trembling from the cold and fear. What seemed like a simple act of survival soon spiraled into something much larger. Villagers, always eager for gossip, saw us together and assumed the worst. Rumors spread like wildfire, leaving Jack with little choice but to marry me in order to preserve his reputation. While I never wanted to force anyone into marriage, I accepted my fate, hoping that perhaps things would improve over time. After our marriage, things did change, but not in the way I had imagined. Our combined labor points allowed us to earn slightly more food, but Jack took it upon himself to exchange most of our coarse grains for refined white flour, which was considered a luxury. At first, I thought he was trying to improve our meals, but I quickly realized his real intentions. Susan began visiting our home frequently, often lingering longer than necessary. Jack, always eager to please her, would say with a smile, "If you like it here, feel free to visit more often. You hardly eat much anyway." His words stung, but what hurt more was the look he gave me, awkward and guilty, as though he knew he was betraying my trust but didn't care enough to stop. It wasn't long before I caught them red-handed. One day, I walked into the kitchen and found Jack secretly sharing the refined flour noodles with Susan. She sat there, her demeanor calm and composed as though she owned the place. Without missing a beat, she greeted me with a smile and said, "Oh, Mary, you're back. Jack made these noodles especially. Would you like some?" Her casual tone and the confidence in her voice made it clear she saw herself as more than just a guest. She acted more like the mistress of the house, and it was obvious that Jack had encouraged this behavior. My hands clenched at my sides, but I kept my composure. Inside, I felt a surge of anger that I could no longer ignore. That day, I made a decision. Turning to Jack, I said firmly, "From now on, let's split our labor points in food. You eat your share, and I'll eat mine." My voice was steady, but my heart was racing. Jack had grown too comfortable relying on my sacrifices. For years, I had deprived myself to ensure he had enough to eat. But I was done being a fool. Before Jack could respond, Susan, always ready to play the victim, let her eyes fill with tears. "Mary, please don't blame Jack," she said, her voice trembling. "It's my fault. Don't argue with him because of me. I won't come here anymore." With that, she ran out the door, sobbing dramatically. Jack turned to me, his face filled with disappointment. Do you really have to be so harsh?" he asked, his tone accusing, as though I was the one at fault. I stared back at him, feeling a mix of anger and disbelief. Harsh? Wasn't it harsh for him to take advantage of my kindness for so many years? Wasn't it harsh for him to let another woman undermine me in my own home? But I didn't bother to explain myself. Instead, I walked away, knowing that I was finally taking back control of my life. Jack could call me harsh all he wanted. It wouldn't change the fact that I was done sacrificing myself for him. "How did you become like this?" Jack's words, filled with exasperation, echoed in the room. In the past, this tactic of his would have worked. He knew exactly how to make me feel guilty, how to twist my emotions until I gave in to his wishes. Back then, I was completely captivated by him. Jack was unlike anyone I had ever met. A tall, educated man, refined in his demeanor, worlds apart from the rough, sunburnt men in the village. I often thought of him as a prince who had somehow stumbled into my ordinary life. If he hadn't pulled me out of the river that day, if he hadn't been the one to save me, perhaps we never would have ended up together. But my insecurities made me cling to him, always seeking his approval, always afraid to disappoint him. I had treated him like a god, someone I couldn't bear to displease. But now, things were different. The woman who had once idolized Jack was gone, replaced by someone who had lived through too much pain to care about his opinions anymore. I gave him a cold, mocking smile, one that carried no warmth. "Think whatever you want," I said, my voice steady and unyielding. For a moment, Jack froze, his expression betraying his surprise. He had never seen this side of me before, the side that no longer cared about his feelings. He stood there silently, unsure of how to respond. I didn't wait for him to recover. I turned and walked into the bedroom, shutting the door behind me. I didn't need to explain myself. Not anymore. A few minutes later, I heard the creak of the wooden floorboards. Jack was walking past the bedroom door with a bowl of noodles in his hands. I didn't need to look to know where he was going. Of course, the noodles he had so carefully prepared for Susan couldn't wait. He had to deliver them to her personally. Only then would he be satisfied. My chest tightened with pain as I realized just how little I meant to him. I had thought that living through an entire lifetime would have dulled the sting of these moments. I had believed that time could bury old wounds, but the bitterness and resentment still lingered, etched into my heart like scars that refused to fade. They reminded me again and again of how foolish I had been to love him so blindly. I turned my gaze away, determined not to let the tears fall. My eyes landed on the calendar hanging on the wall. Picking it up, I flipped through the pages until I found the date of the college entrance exams. With a heavy hand, I circled it, marking the day that could change everything. In my previous life, I had dreamed of taking those exams, of escaping the life that seemed to trap me. Though I had grown up in the village, I had studied diligently through high school. When the exams were reinstated, I had dared to hope for a brighter future. But by then, I was already married to Jack. There was no money, and someone had to support the family. My dreams were pushed aside, buried under the weight of responsibilities I hadn't asked for. I sacrificed everything to help Jack succeed. I worked tirelessly, saved every penny, and endured countless hardships so he could focus on his study. By the time he became successful, I thought I might finally have a chance to pursue my own dreams, but life had other plans. When I tried to pick up my books again, our neglected daughter sat beside me, crying uncontrollably. Jack stormed out of his study, frustration written all over his face. "Do you even know how to be a mother?" he snapped. "How can you ignore your own child like this?" His words were sharp and unforgiving, as if I had failed some unspoken test. When I suggested he help with the child, he shot back angrily. "If I don't work, how are we supposed to feed the family?" And so I compromised. I gave up my dreams, one small piece at a time, until there was nothing left of the girl I used to be. I worked harder, endured more, and stayed silent, thinking it was the right thing to do. The years slipped away, leaving wrinkles on my face and robbing me of my youth. The sacrifices I made went unnoticed, unappreciated, as though they were expected of me. But not this time. This time, I wouldn't let my dreams be buried again. This time, I would fight for myself, no matter what. On quiet, sleepless nights, I would sit by the dim light of the oil lamp, poring over the college entrance exam materials from years past. Each page I read seemed to resonate with the weight of the dreams I had once buried. I memorized formulas, reread passages, and solved problems as though I could somehow erase the regrets etched into my heart. But this time, things were different. Heaven had handed me a second chance, a chance to rewrite my fate. This time, no one would stop me. Not Jack, not Susan, not anyone. I silently counted the days in my mind. Just one more month. 1 month was all I needed to prepare to prove that my life could be more than just sacrifices for someone else's success. That evening, Jack returned home much later than usual. The house was quiet, the kitchen cold, and the stove untouched. For the first time, there wasn't a warm meal waiting for him. I watched him out of the corner of my eye as he stood in the kitchen, clearly taken aback. He looked around, confused and unsettled, as if the absence of dinner was some terrible omen. It had only been a day of this new normal, and yet it was already enough to throw him off balance. Later, he noticed that his belongings had been moved to the storage room. He stood outside the door for what felt like an eternity, his hesitant footsteps betraying his unease. I lay on the bed, pretending to be asleep, but I could hear him shifting nervously. Finally, he spoke, his voice soft, almost pleading. "What happened today? It's my fault," he said, his tone full of forced sincerity. "You know, Susan isn't an outsider. We both came from the city as part of the youth program. She's just a girl, unfamiliar with life here. As her big brother, it's my responsibility to look after her. She's not used to coarse grains like we are. She's lost weight, and I couldn't just ignore that." His excuses made my stomach turn. Big brother? What a convenient title for someone who would one day share a bed with his so-called little sister. The room grew silent, except for the sound of our breathing. After a long pause, Jack spoke again, his voice lower, almost as if he was speaking to himself. "If it makes you unhappy, I won't let her come here for meals anymore." I didn't respond. I turned over in bed, pulling the thin blanket tighter around me, feigning sleep. It didn't matter what promises he made tonight. I knew Jack too well. As soon as Susan came crying to him with her soft, pleading voice and crocodile tears, he would forget everything he'd said. He would once again be at her beck and call. It was a pattern I had seen too many times to believe otherwise. In the days that followed, I threw myself into my studies, finding comfort in the focus it required. Every spare moment was spent with my books, solving equations, and memorizing passages. My determination grew stronger with each passing day. Jack, on the other hand, was visibly struggling. He had planned to dedicate his time to preparing for the exams, but now he faced new challenges. Since I insisted on dividing our food supplies, he had no choice but to spend his days out in the fields, hoe in hand, to earn his own labor points. Without my support, he had to ensure there was enough refined flour for himself and, of course, for Susan, who still clung to her refined taste. For once, Jack's life wasn't cushioned by my sacrifice. I watched him from a distance as he toiled in the fields, his once smooth hands blistering under the harsh sun. Yet even then, I felt no pity. This was the life he had chosen, the life he had so casually left me to bear alone. Meanwhile, I quietly nurtured the spark of hope within me. Every page I studied, every problem I solved brought me closer to a future where I didn't need to depend on anyone. This time, I was fighting for myself, and I wasn't going to stop until I won. Rumors spread like wildfire through the village, their whispers echoing in every corner. They claimed I was hoarding white flour to keep Jack tethered to the countryside, ensuring he couldn't take the college entrance exams and escape to the city. To them, I was a scheming wife, desperate to trap a man who didn't belong to me. It wasn't uncommon for educated youth sent to the countryside to marry local girls out of convenience, only to leave their wives and children behind when they found a way back to the city. Once there, they easily remarried, finding city-born wives who better suited their ambitions. The gossip grew louder when someone confronted Jack about it. Instead of denying the accusations outright, he dodged the questions with vague, non-committal answers. His evasiveness only fueled the flames, making the rumors seem even more believable. I remained unaware of the chatter until 5 days later, when an elderly neighbor approached me. With a sly grin, she said, "You're a smart girl, keeping your man in check. What good are books or a university degree? If a man gets too successful, he'll just fly away and leave you behind. Her tone wasn't one of support, but of amusement, as though my supposed scheming was an entertaining spectacle. To her and the others, I was just a poor village girl who should be grateful for whatever scraps of attention Jack gave me. They saw me as someone beneath him, a burden he carried reluctantly. Naturally, they assumed I'd go to any length to hold on to him. The thought churned my stomach. I wanted to tell her she was wrong, to explain that I had no interest in clinging to Jack anymore. But before I could respond, a familiar voice called out from behind me. "Sis!" Turning around, I saw Zhang walking toward me, a large sack of grain slung over his shoulder. His shirt clung to his thin frame, drenched in sweat from the midday sun. As he reached me, he dropped the sack onto the ground with a loud thud and wiped his brow with his sleeve. A grin spread across his face, though it was tinged with exhaustion. "If you need white flour, just tell me, sub," he said with a laugh. "Eat as much as you want. Let your brother-in-law stay home and study. If he gets into college, he can take you to the city and you'll finally have a good life." Zhang's words made my heart ache. He didn't know how hollow those dreams of a better life with Jack truly were. My younger brother, only 2 years my junior, had always been my silent protector. We had grown up under difficult circumstances. After our mother passed away when I was 5 and Zhang was barely 2, our father remarried. Though he did his best to care for us, life with the stepmother was never easy, especially after she bore children of her own. Jiang and I often found ourselves on the fringes, relying on each other for comfort. I didn't know how Jiang had managed to get his hands on so much grain. Looking at his frail, bony frame, so thin he seemed almost hollow, I felt a surge of guilt and sorrow. He was at an age when he should have been full of life, yet his sacrifices for me weighed heavily on his shoulders. Tears welled up in my eyes, but I quickly blinked them away, not wanting to show weakness. As much as his gesture touched me, I vowed to ensure that neither of us would have to endure such hardships again. This second chance wasn't just for me, it was for him too. Zhang's brows knitted tightly as he asked, "Sis, what's wrong? Did Jack mistreat you? Just say the word and I'll deal with him." His protective tone reminded me of a scene from my previous life. After I had moved to the city, my world had spiraled into chaos. Jiang had come to visit me then, his life in the countryside leaving him weathered and prematurely aged. He arrived wearing worn-out clothes, but his concern for me hadn't wavered. I remembered vividly how his eyes reddened when he saw me sitting down to eat a simple meal of plain white rice with pickled vegetables. Without hesitation, he shoved the last 200 yuan he had into my hand. "Take this," he said gruffly, avoiding my gaze. I ran after him to return the money, but by then, he was already hurrying down the street, his thin frame hunched over as he moved as fast as he could. He was in his 30s by then, but ran as if he were still a boy, afraid I might catch him. That act of unconditional love had shattered me. In Jack's household, I had been reduced to nothing more than a voiceless shadow, a mother and wife who wasn't allowed to complain, merely an extension of Jack's convenience. But Zhang's gesture had reminded me of a kind of care I thought I'd lost forever. I didn't want to burden him any further, so I forced a smile and replied, I'm fine, Zhang. Everything's going well." But even as I spoke, tears betrayed me, streaming down my face. I quickly turned away, making up an excuse to send him on his way. Though he left reluctantly, I knew he didn't believe my words. Still, I couldn't bear to weigh him down with my trouble. He had already given me more than I could have asked for. That evening, Jack returned from the fields, his clothes dusty and his shoulders slumped. When he spotted the sack of grain on the floor, his face lit up for a fleeting moment before turning hesitant. "Your family came by?" he asked awkwardly. I smirked, unable to hide my sarcasm. "Yes, they did. They heard the rumors about how I'm supposedly starving you to death for refined white flour and thought I might drown in everyone's spit. So they brought this to help me survive the public shame." Jack's face turned a deep shade of red. "Mary," he stammered, "I know I've let you down, but don't drag Susan into this. She's a city girl. She's not used to this kind of gossip. I'm just worried about her." His words hung in the air, unfinished but painfully clear. My chest tightened at the memory of a similar situation in my past life. Back then, our daughter had fallen dangerously ill with a high fever. I had already spent all the money we had on keeping the household afloat. Left with no choice, we borrowed from one of Jack's colleagues to pay for her hospital treatment. Jack's colleague had been visibly confused. "Professor Jack, you have a decent salary. How do you not have savings for emergencies like this?" Jack hadn't dared to admit that most of his earnings had been handed over to Susan for her ventures. Instead, he shifted the blame onto me, saying, I give my entire paycheck to my wife. Those words had burned like a brand on my soul, a stark reminder of the endless sacrifices I had made for a man who couldn't even take responsibility for his own actions. By the time I uncovered the truth, it was already too late. In Jack's social circle, I had gained a reputation as a reckless, wasteful woman. Everyone sympathized with him, shaking their heads over how he had ended up with someone like me. Even the neighbors joined the chorus. Once, one of them stood on my doorstep, wagging her finger at me. "Mary," she said, her tone dripping with condescension, "you're not very educated, and you spend your days indulging yourself, eating, drinking, and doing nothing worthwhile. If you don't shape up, mark my words, Jack will leave you and you'll regret it when it's too late." Their words stung like needles, though I hid my hurt. Unable to hold it in any longer, I confronted Jack that evening, my voice trembling with frustration. "Why are you treating me like this? Do you even care about the things people say?" I expected some sign of remorse, or at least an apology, but instead Jack's face hardened with righteous indignation. "So what if people talk? You're just a housewife. You barely step outside, so what does it matter? Susan is different. She's running a business, Mary. Reputation is everything for her. We can't let baseless gossip ruin her standing." His words cut deeper than I could have imagined. The familiar sting of disappointment washed over me. Time may have turned back, but Jack remained unchanged. His priorities were still skewed, and I had no place among them. As I turned to walk away, wanting nothing more than to escape his presence, he grabbed my arm, his grip firm. His face was strained, almost desperate. "Mary, please," he said, his tone softening. "Promise me you won't bring this up with Susan. She's sensitive. She can't handle this sort of thing. Once I pass the college entrance exams and we move back to the city, I'll stop dealing with her entirely. It'll just be the two of us, living a good life together." His words might have sounded like reassurance to someone else, but to me, they felt like a knife twisting in an already open wound. 1,000 unspoken questions surged through my mind. Why, Jack? Why was Susan's dignity always worth safeguarding, while mine was discarded so carelessly? Why was I the one who had to endure humiliation while he played the role of a gallant protector for her? I wanted to scream at him, to pour out all the bitterness and anguish that had been festering inside me, but I didn't. I lowered my eyes, swallowed the lump in my throat, and forced my emotions into submission. I had learned the hard way that some people will never change, no matter how much you plead or explain. People who pretend to be asleep will never wake up. Resigned, I allowed a cold smile to form on my lips as I replied, "Don't worry, Jack. I won't trouble her." My voice was steady, emotionless, like a stranger's. I turned and walked back to my room, closing the door behind me. The silence enveloped me, but my mind was anything but calm. My eyes fell on the calendar, the bold red circles marking the days that lay ahead. A renewed determination stirred within me. I wasn't going to waste my time on someone like Jack anymore. My path was now clear, and it was one I would walk alone, free from the shadows of my past mistakes. I told myself over and over again, "Mary, you don't have much longer to endure. Just 20 more days, and you'll be free." That thought became my anchor, the hope that kept me steady amidst the chaos. I resolved to maintain this charade, keeping up appearances without faltering. Jack still walked around with his false sense of security, thinking time was on his side. Little did he know this exam would be his only real opportunity to escape his future miseries. Once he returned to the city, his indolent brothers would have already claimed the family house and any job prospects. His selfish, domineering mother, far from supporting him, would drain him dry, using every bit of his energy to sustain her other sons. It wasn't my concern anymore. I had long stopped caring about what would become of him. Each day brought me closer to the exam date, and I focused entirely on my studies. Jack's presence faded into the background. Perhaps guilt gnawed at him. Or maybe he was simply trying to avoid conflict, but he stopped visiting Susan. The food he once personally brought her was now delivered by other educated youths. He began leaving early in the mornings and coming home late, trying to avoid crossing paths with me. Then, one evening, Jack came home carrying a small nest of bird eggs. The sight of them caught me off guard. My mind immediately flashed back to when we were newlyweds. One afternoon, he had come back from the forest with a similar gift, a handful of eggs. I remembered how happy I'd been. I had boiled them carefully, and we'd sat together, smiling and sharing each one equally. Those moments of simplicity had meant the world to me, but now, looking at the eggs he held, I felt nothing but disgust. Did he really think such a gesture could erase all the pain he'd caused me? that a slap followed by a sweet treat could heal the wounds he had inflicted. Oddly enough, it wasn't Jack who cracked first under the weight of our strained relationship. It was Susan. One afternoon, while I was gathering firewood in the hills, she appeared out of nowhere, stepping into my path. Her appearance was striking as always. She wore a pale pink blouse, its slightly open collar, revealing her slender, porcelain-like neck. The fabric looked out of place in the rugged countryside, much like Susan herself, a delicate flower in a wild, untamed forest. In contrast, I felt like the soil beneath her feet, weathered, unremarkable, deeply rooted in this harsh light. I caught myself staring for a moment, my thoughts drifting. She noticed my gaze and smiled faintly, a flicker of pride flashing in her eye. "Looks good, doesn't it?" she said, her voice light and casual. "Jack used ration coupons to get this fabric for me." Her words were a deliberate jab meant to remind me of her importance to Jack. She stood there with the confidence of someone who believed herself untouchable, certain that her delicate beauty and Jack's devotion would shield her from any consequences. I didn't respond immediately. I simply stood there, clutching the firewood in my hands and letting her words hang in the air. Inside, I felt a quiet fury simmering, but I kept my expression neutral. There was no need for anger. The exam date was coming closer, and every step I took brought me nearer to a future where Susan and Jack no longer had any power over. I smiled faintly, more to myself than to her, stepped around her without saying a word. Susan stood there, her expression smug, as though she expected me to be furious, but I seemed to think she had something over me, something she could use to hurt me. Jack had done far more for her than just he had given her the resources to start her own business, introduced her to influential people, and helped her carve out a future. In the past, I would have been consumed with anger over all. I would have tossed and turned in bed, too upset to sleep, questioning everything. I would have argued with him, and we would have fought endlessly. But over time, I grew tired of all the fighting. The anger lost its fire, and I simply stopped caring. It wasn't worth my time to be upset. As I started to turn away, Susan stepped in front of me again, blocking my path. Her voice was full of disdain as she sneered at Mary. She said, "Do you really think Jack would have ever looked at you if you hadn't tricked him? You made him save you by pretending to drown. Jack doesn't belong with you. He doesn't belong in this miserable village. He has bigger dreams, bigger ambitions." Her words were meant to cut deep, but they didn't have the same effect they once did. In my past life, hearing them had caused me endless pain. She had said the same things to me then, sitting in the back of a fancy car while I walked home from the market carrying groceries. She had looked at me like I was nothing, like I was beneath her. She told me that Jack had only married me to have someone take care of his home and bear his children, that I was no different than a nanny. And in that moment, her words had stung like a sharp knife in my heart. But now, after everything, those words didn't hurt me. They only made me laugh coldly. I turned to face her and asked in a calm, icy voice, "Is that all you've got? Have you finished?" I took a step closer to her and added, "If you really cared so much about Jack, why didn't you make a move before we got married? You were busy with the village chief's son, weren't you? You thought you could use him to get back to the city, but when the exams came back, you realized you hadn't bothered studying. You knew you couldn't make it on your own." Her face twisted in frustration as I spoke, her pride cracking. Then, before I could say anything else, she suddenly dropped to her knees, the sound of her fall echoing in the quiet air. Tears began to flow down her face, and she looked up at me with desperation. "Sis-in-law," she sobbed, "I promise I'll stay away from Jack. I'll never come near him again. Please don't tell the commune about this. It would ruin him. I'm begging you." I watched her for a moment, unsure of how to respond. She was so dramatic, her tears almost fake. It was clear that she wasn't really sorry, but she had learned to play the game. She had learned how to make people feel guilty for her mistakes. I felt nothing for her, but a deep sense of indifference. Jack and Susan both had their own lives to live, but I wasn't going to let them ruin mine. Before I could fully understand what was happening, Susan suddenly pushed me hard. I lost my balance and fell down the slope, the firewood I had been carrying scattering all around me. My ankle scraped against a piece of wood, and soon blood started dripping down onto the ground. I was still trying to regain my bearings when a figure rushed past me, moving quickly towards Susan. When I finally managed to steady myself and looked up, I saw Jack holding Susan in his arms. She was covered in dirt but seemed otherwise unharmed. Jack's gaze was cold and sharp as he looked at me. "I've told you before," he said, his voice clipped. "If you're angry, take it out on. Why do you have to make trouble for someone who hasn't done anything wrong?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Someone who hasn't done anything wrong?" I repeated coldly, pulling up my pant leg to show him the scrape on my ankle. the blood dripping steadily. Are you blind, Jack? Do people who harm others usually end up hurting themselves like this? My voice was steady, but my anger burned inside me. Jack glanced down at the blood pooling around my ankle, and for a brief moment his expression softened, but then Susan, her eyes wide with tears, clutched at his sleeve. Jack, she sobbed, it's my fault. I shouldn't have pushed her. I was afraid she might report us to the commune. If something happens to your record, you won't be able to take the college entrance exam. Her words were said in such a pitiful tone that it made my stomach turn. Jack looked at her, then at me, and the moment of softness in his eyes disappeared. He cast me a cold glance, then turned and carried Susan away, her head resting against his shoulder as she continued to cry. I watched them go, my fists clenched tightly, but as they disappeared from view, I felt the cold numbness slowly start to spread through my heart, and I knew, deep down, that it didn't matter anymore. Only 10 days remained, and I could endure it for that long. I didn't need anything else. Jack didn't return home until very late that night, likely spending time with Susan to calm her down. From that point on, he seemed to find more and more reasons to meet with her, even during the night. I didn't know what they were doing outside, and frankly, I didn't care anymore. I lay in bed, replaying the lessons I had reviewed earlier that day. My mind was clear, and the information seemed to come to me easily, almost effortlessly. In my previous life, I had struggled to retain anything, no matter how many times I read it. But now it felt as if my mind was young again, and everything I studied simply clicked into place. Still, despite the comfort I found in studying, there was an unease in my chest, as if I had forgotten something important. And that feeling grew stronger when I was jolted awake in the middle of the night by a loud crack. As I lay there in the rain, I suddenly remembered something from my previous life. Around this time, there had been a massive storm. The house Jack and I lived in was old and falling apart, provided by the village for the educated youth. It was poorly maintained, and during that storm, the roof caved in under the heavy rain. At that time, Jack and I weren't home, so we were safe. But this time, things were different. The rain pelted my face in harsh, cold drops, and a deafening thunderclap shook the sky. I could barely see through the darkness, but I could make out the broken roof tiles and the beams that had fallen around me. The house was in ruins, and it was clear it couldn't stand much longer. I shivered in the cold rain, pushing my way through the debris as I tried to get to safety. This was not how I imagined using my second chance. I hadn't yet taken the college entrance exams, nor had I built a better life for Ji-young and me. I thought to myself, I can't die here, not like this. But just as I thought that, the wall next to me, weakened by the storm, gave way. The heavy rain had caused it to collapse, trapping me beneath the rubble. The weight of the debris felt suffocating, and I struggled to move. I screamed for help, but the sound of the rain drowned out my voice. It felt like everything was closing in on me, and I couldn't help but feel a deep bitterness. Why had heaven given me this second chance only to trap me like this? I hated Jack. If he hadn't gone to see Susan, I wouldn't be in this situation. But more than that, I hated myself. I had become so focused on studying for the exams that I had forgotten about something so important. The rain continued to pour, and the cold seeped into my bones, draining the last bit of warmth from my body. As I felt myself drifting into unconsciousness, I heard a faint voice calling my name. Someone was shouting, and the sound was distant yet urgent. I blinked, trying to focus, and when I opened my eyes, I saw Ji-young. He was standing in the rain, desperately digging at the soil with his bare hands. "Sis, don't fall asleep," he cried, his voice breaking. "I'll get you out soon, I promise." His face was a mix of tears and determination as he called for help. "Someone help! My sister's trapped!" His frantic cries were enough to bring my father and some of the villagers rushing to the scene. They worked quickly to free me, and eventually, they managed to lift me from the rubble. When I was finally pulled out and placed on the ground, someone shouted, "Wait! Isn't Jack still inside? Is he trapped under the rubble too?" There was panic in the air as they started to look for him, but they didn't have to search long. Jack stood in the crowd, holding an umbrella over Susan's head. The commotion had drawn nearly everyone from the village, and the area was brightly lit by torches and lanterns. When Jack saw me, he stood still, his eyes meeting mine. His expression was unreadable, and I could feel my heart sinking. Jack's expression shifted as he saw me, and the umbrella he had been holding fell from his hand. He rushed toward me, but Ji-young was quicker. In a flash, he kicked Jack hard, sending him sprawling into the mud. Without a second thought, Ji-young pinned Jack to the ground and began punching him furiously. "You bastard!" Ji-young shouted, his voice shaking with anger. "Where were you when my sister needed you?" Do you realize she almost died just now? As Ji Young's words rang out, Susan let out a shrill scream, rushing to pull Ji Young away, but he was too angry to stop. He swung his arm back and slapped her hard across the face. "You shameless woman!" he yelled. "I've had enough of you. You sit here every day eating the white bread my brother sends you and still cling to my sister? How low can you go? Stealing someone else's man." His fury was overwhelming, and it was clear that everything that had been building up inside him was finally spilling out. The scene had already caught the attention of the villagers who were watching the confrontation unfold. Jack's late-night appearances with Susan had already raised suspicions, and now Ji Young's outburst only made things worse. One villager muttered, "I told you something was off with those two." Another added, "I've seen Jack sneaking food to Susan more than once. When I asked him about it, he had the nerve to say Mary told him to do it." The accusations kept coming, and the mood in the crowd grew darker. "Men from the city are unreliable," one person muttered. "They've got wives but can't keep their eyes to themselves." Someone else scowled and said, "And Susan is just as bad. She knows he's married, but she still goes after him. That's how people from the city act, huh?" The villagers' voices grew louder, their judgment sharper with each passing moment. Meanwhile, Susan stood there, her face flushed with embarrassment and her eyes filled with tears. She desperately looked at Jack, who was still lying on the ground, unable to move. It wasn't until the murmurs of the crowd reached a peak that Jack finally stirred, slowly getting to his feet. He looked disoriented and defeated, and as he stood, he called out weakly, "Ji Young, let me go. I need to check on your sister." But Susan, overwhelmed by the villagers' harsh words, burst into uncontrollable sobs. She grabbed her face with her hands as if to shield herself from the shame, and then ran off into the night, disappearing into the rain. The storm was still pouring down, and my father glanced at me, noticing the pale look on my face. He called out to Ji Young, stopping him from delivering another punch to Jack. But Ji Young wasn't finished yet. He threw one final punch, sending Jack back into the mud. "Don't think my sister is easy to bully," Ji Young warned, his voice cold and full of venom. "I'm letting you off easy this time, but if you ever do this again, I'll kill you." As we began to walk away, the crowd slowly started to disperse, leaving Jack behind in the rain-soaked dirt. He lay motionless, the storm washing over him, as if the world had turned its back on him. In the dark of the night, as the distance between Jack and me grew with every step I took, I couldn't help but feel a sense of finality. It was like when I had married him in my previous life. After everything, I knew I was walking away from him, and this time, I wasn't looking back. Things at home felt different now. My place in the family had been taken away. The village chief had arranged for me to stay in a small storage room that had been hastily cleaned up. It wasn't much, but it was a place to rest for the night. My father, having made sure I was settled, left at my stepmother's urging. She was always in a hurry, pushing him to go back home. The events of the day felt like a whirlwind, and I was left standing there trying to make sense of everything. I sat in the small room, staring at the bare walls, feeling completely alone. The weight of everything that had happened was still sinking in when I suddenly remembered the textbooks I had left behind in the muddy water. My heart sank, knowing they were probably ruined. Panic gripped me, and I quickly jumped to my feet, ready to go back for them. But before I could take a step, Ji Young stopped me. He was holding a bundle in his hands. "Sis, is this what you're looking for?" he asked. I took the bundle from him, my hands shaking. When I opened it and saw that the textbooks were intact, I couldn't stop the tears from falling. I had feared the worst, but here they were, safe and sound. "Thank goodness," I whispered to myself, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. Ji Young watched me for a moment, his eyes full of concern. "Sis," he asked hesitantly, "are you planning to take the college entrance exam?" His words made me pause. I didn't know when he had figured it out or how much he knew about the situation with Jack and Susan. I had tried so hard to keep him away from it, to protect him from the mess of my life, but it seemed like he knew more than I realized. I felt a heavy bitterness inside. I nodded, the decision already made in my mind. Ji Young then asked, his voice uncertain, "And what about Jack?" I could see the worry in his eyes, the loyalty he felt for me. I knew he would stand by me, even fight for me if he had to, but the thought of divorce had never crossed his mind. In this time and place, divorce carried a huge stigma. Even if Jack was in the wrong, I would be the one left with the shame, simply because I was the woman. "I'm going to divorce him," I said firmly, the words leaving my mouth with a finality I hadn't expected. Ji Young's eyes widened in shock, and for a long time, he didn't say anything. He was probably still processing it all. He was willing to stand up for me, to defend me, but this was different. Divorce wasn't just a solution. It was a complete change, a break from everything we had known. Just then, a knock on the door interrupted us. My heart sank when I heard Jack's voice from the other side, muffled by the door. "Mary, are you there?" "It's me." I could see the anger flash in Ji Young's eyes, but I raised my hand, stopping him. "I'll handle this," I said quietly. There were things I needed to say, things I had been holding back for far too long. I walked over to the door, my heart pounding in my chest. Standing there, Jack was soaked to the bone, his face bruised and swollen from the punches Ji Young had given him. Despite his disheveled appearance, he looked at me with concern, his eyes filled with worry. "Mary, are you hurt? Are you okay?" His voice was soft, filled with genuine care, but his concern felt hollow, like a cruel joke. It didn't matter now. I couldn't see any meaning in his words anymore. "I'm fine," I said coldly, my tone flat. Then, without wasting another moment, I got straight to the point. "Jack, let's get a divorce." A flash of lightning lit up the sky, and in that brief moment, I saw the shock on his face. He opened his mouth, trying to speak, but his words faltered. "Mary, I know you're angry. What happened today was my fault. I shouldn't have been away when you were in danger. I'll change. I promise. I won't let anything like this happen again." I had no patience left for his empty promise. I cut him off sharp. "And what about Susan?" I asked, my voice cold and steady, ready for the truth. "Are you really just going to leave your sister behind like this?" I asked, my voice sharp with frustration. "How long are you going to keep pretending that your divided attention is just a brotherly concern? How much longer will you keep fooling?" My words seemed to hit him hard, and I could see it in his face. His lips trembled slightly as he tried to respond. "It's not like that. I only helped Susan because she needed it. I've already written a letter to my family. I told them I want to bring you back to the city with me. I've made up my mind. I want to spend my life with you." He looked at me, waiting for a response, but I remained silent for a moment. Finally, I spoke, my tone cold. "Is that so? Well, I don't care anymore." His face fell at my word, and I saw something in his eyes. Defeat. He forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eye. "It's okay," he said quietly. "I'll wait for you to change your mind. We have plenty of time. I'll make you forgive me." I didn't say anything, simply closed the door, leaving him standing outside, still hopeful, but I couldn't bring myself to care. There was nothing left to say. 3 days remained, and soon I would begin a new life, one without him, a life where Jack was nothing more than a distant memory. On the day of the college entrance exam, Ji Young woke up early to see me off. I could see the worry in his eyes, but he said nothing. As we arrived at the exam site, I saw Jack standing near the entrance with Susan beside him. She was talking to him, but he looked distracted, his attention more on the crowd than her. When he saw us, his eyes brightened, and he quickly approached me. His tone was soft, almost pleading. "Mary, are you here to wish me luck?" he asked, his voice full of hope. "Don't worry, I'll do my best. When we're back in the city, I'll make sure you live a good life." Before I could say anything, Ji Young cut in sharply. "You're delusional. She's here to take the exam, not to wish you luck." Susan let out a loud, mocking laugh from beside him, her face full of scorn. She clearly didn't think someone like me, a simple village girl, had any business taking the college entrance exam. Jack too looked surprised, but it was almost amusing. Even Ji Young had known I was preparing for this exam, but Jack, someone who lived with me every day, had no idea. He opened his mouth, probably to say something, but before he could, the bell rang, signaling the start of the exam. I walked past him and joined the crowd entering the exam hall, leaving him and Susan behind. The next few days were intense, but I poured everything I had into the exam. This was my chance, the dream I had held on to for so long. Jack and Susan no longer mattered, and they quickly faded from my mind as I focused on the test before me. When the exam finally ended, I didn't go back to the village. Instead, I traveled to the neighboring town where my cousin ran a small clothing shop. She had heard I was looking to save money and offered me a job. I gladly accepted, knowing this was a new beginning. Every day, I woke up early to start my work at the shop. I cleaned the space, arranged the items neatly, and greeted customers with a smile as they entered and left. My routine was simple, but it gave me a sense of purpose. I was so busy that the days seemed to fly by without me even noticing. I felt content with the life I was building, focused on the small joys of my work and the progress I was making on my own. One afternoon, as I was sorting through some fabrics, I heard the door to the shop burst open. I looked up to see Ji Young, breathless with excitement, rushing toward me. He looked so happy, it was as if he couldn't wait to tell me something important. He grabbed my hands and said, "Sis, you did it! You got into college." My heart skipped a beat, and I almost couldn't believe what I was hearing. With shaking hands, I took the envelope he handed me. I opened it carefully, and there it was, my acceptance letter to college. the very thing I had dreamed of in my past life. Tears filled my eyes before I could even stop them. I had made it. I had escaped the fate I was once doomed to. From that moment on, my life would be different. A new path awaited me. As Ji Young wiped away my tears, he couldn't hide the pride in his voice. "Sis, you don't know yet, do you?" he said with a grin. "You're the only one from the village who got in, except for one other educated youth. Jack and Susan didn't make it. It's so funny, isn't it? They acted like they were so sure of themselves, and now they're just a joke." I wasn't surprised by this news. Jack was a smart person, but he had been distracted by his drama with Susan. He had hardly spent any time studying in the last few months. As for Susan, I had known she wouldn't pass. She hadn't passed in my previous life either. I took a deep breath, then calmly asked, "Did you take care of what I asked you to do?" Ji Young raised an eyebrow and smirked. "It's done. I read the divorce agreement you wrote aloud to Jack in front of the village chief. You should have seen his face. He looked like he'd been hit by lightning. He turned pale and said he wouldn't agree to it. He said he would wait for you forever." Ji Young sneered, "So heartbroken now. Do better before." It's pathetic. I couldn't help but chuckle at his words. Jack's feelings didn't matter to me anymore. It was all in the past. His actions and promises no longer had any impact on my life. To me, he was nothing more than a distant memory, a stranger who no longer had any place in my world. From this point forward, our paths would never cross again. The last time I saw Jack was 6 years later. By then, I had graduated from college, found a stable job, and even gotten engaged. On that day, Ji Young invited me and my fiancé to a meal in the provincial capital. Since I had gone to college in the city, I had brought Ji Young with me, and we had made a life there. This was a new chapter full of opportunities and possibilities, and Jack was long forgotten in the past. When I first arrived in the city, I helped Ji Young start a small business by setting up a stall outside the school gates. At first, it was just a simple way to make some money, but as the months passed, Ji Young learned a lot from others and started sourcing products from suppliers in Guangzhou. His business grew steadily, and before long, he was making enough to buy a house and even a car. It amazed me to see how far he had come. Years passed, and the last time I saw him, Ji Young was dressed sharply in a suit, his presence full of confidence. He looked nothing like the young man who had once been struggling to make ends meet. He had transformed into someone who seemed to belong to the city, more polished and successful than most people who had grown up here. We had just finished a meal at a restaurant, and as we stepped outside, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. Not far from the restaurant, I saw a street vendor hunched over, carefully creating sugar paintings for children. He moved slowly, his back bent and his limp unmistakable. When he saw me, his face flickered with panic. Without thinking, he abandoned the money he had earned and rushed away, pushing his cart as quickly as he could, limping awkwardly as he went. It was Jack. I had heard bits and pieces about him over the years, mostly from Ji Young, who still held a grudge against him. After returning to the city, Jack had married Susan, and he had planned to retake the college entrance exam. But things hadn't gone well for him. His family didn't have the money to support him like I once had, and he struggled to find a steady job. Eventually, he had to settle for street vending, a far cry from the life he had once dreamed of. As time went on, Susan, who had been used to a more comfortable life, couldn't handle the reality of their new situation. She wanted a better life than what Jack could provide. She eventually scammed someone out of a large sum of money using Jack's name, then disappeared, leaving Jack and their newborn daughter behind. The creditors came after Jack, and in the chaos, they broke one of his legs, leaving him helpless. From that point, his life had spiraled into the hard existence I now saw him living. My fiancé, who had been walking beside me, noticed Jack's pitiful state and asked, "Who is that? Why did he run off when he saw us?" I didn't look back at Jack. Instead, I simply replied, "Just someone from my past. Don't worry about him." I took my fiancé's arm and urged him, "Let's go." And with that, we left Jack behind, just another chapter in my life that I had long since closed.